Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by The Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited to have first-time guest, relatively recent new colleague, who I have not met before, and I'm only meeting her intermediated between ones and zeros here, which is not quite the same thing. Christine Emba. She's now a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute. She's a writer about many subjects, including this sort of state of gender relations and whatnot. Christine, welcome to the Remnant.
Thanks so much for having me, Jonah. And I'm sure we will meet in person soon.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I'm such a misanthrope. I spend most of my time like Howard Hughes with Kleenex boxes on my feet. That no, but I try to get into the office more and more. It's just it's hard.
It's not your house. It's like further away than it needs to be perfectly comfortable. So
yeah,
I understand.
And
that.
I got the Dispatch, and I got my dogs here at the house, and the dogs, they have needs. So anyway, so where do we just sort of start big picture, and you can take it any direction you want to go. I've been married for 23 years, something like that. So the 23 years, yes. Got that right.
Your wife is somewhere like, oh, come on.
Yeah. Oops. So I'm not. I can't claim to have my finger on the pulse of the dating scene. But I have a whole bunch of 20-something and early 30-something colleagues at the Dispatch, and also obviously AI and all kinds of stuff. So I get a lot of this secondhand, and I have a 22-year-old daughter. So like I follow it with a mix of utter bewilderment and head shaking curmudgeonliness. So how would you characterize the state of play between the sexes and these days?
The state of play, it's bad. Is how I would characterize it. And I'd be interested in hearing what your sources are telling you, and whether it aligns with that general assessment. But what we're seeing is just like a drop in, I guess, the state of play. Young people are pairing up less, despite in many cases wanting to. Going out on dates less. The age of first marriage is becoming later, and the marriage rate is dropping for many people. It's estimated by some researchers that 1 in 4 millennial women will just end up not married, throughout their lives, which is a much greater proportion than in the past. When it comes to gender relations, I think there's an increasing distrust between men and women, which has, I think, actually been supercharged by sort of this election season and recent politics. And by recent politics, of course, I mean Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Young women, I think, are feeling more sort of threatened and aversive to this political moment, while young men, for various reasons, are often embracing it. So you're seeing a political divide, which is also a belief divide and sort of a personality divide, that is making pairing off, I think, even harder. What are your sources telling you, Joe?
Such a journalist move. So I want to be real clear. I have my daughter basically treats her dating life as if it is a highly classified subject that I do not have clearance for. So I hear much of this stuff second or third hand from my wife or some other people, and I'll just leave her out of it. That's probably the most I've talked about my daughter's personal life in 3 years on this podcast. But one gets the sense, and so I should say that beyond that, my sample is not reflective of of the median young single female, because like for complicated reasons I end up knowing a lot of socially or culturally or theologically conservative young women. I know AI's orbit, we're not exactly the Vatican, but it's got
thank goodness.
Well, I tell you, dating there is really low.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough. Women are not going to meet a lot of people.
But one just generally gets the sense that all of the cliches of my youth or I shouldn't say all of them. A lot of the cliches of my youth are sort of on steroids now, that men are afraid to commit, men are afraid to make the first move, men are afraid, all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, like, I gotta say the the exaggerated version of it, which I maybe you have a better sense because social media is not real life, but like this whole incel thing, I
Yeah.
find so utterly bizarre and hard to comprehend because in my youth, there were lots of men who were not having sex and were upset about it. There were lots of men who never had sex and were really upset about it. There were no men bragging about it.
Right. They didn't like form a club
They didn't form a
online to talk
club, and
about it.
they didn't create a sort of really perverted identity politics, kind of like, we're an aggrieved class and we need a remedy. I mean, men talked about remedies, but they were fairly retail. It was not a political process. So,
Like, go on a date.
yeah, exactly. And so I find I also I can't I missed the online dating thing almost entirely. There were just a handful of people I knew who used things like JDate back when I was still in that world. And JDate was kind of different because it was for conservative or Orthodox Jews who were insistent on meeting other Jews. And so the culture of it was just very, very different. And now this whole swipe right, swipe left leaves me utterly baffled. But I think my sense is that a lot of young women do not like it. They feel at sea in it. And they do not trust that they're going to find the kinds of men that they want to find through that process, but there isn't another one available to them. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, yeah. So a couple of like different trends that I'm observing that I think you're kind of calling out in this description. So first of all, this like idea of men being afraid or holding back in a way that they didn't used to, not asking people out, also maybe not committing, but especially like not being the ones to pursue, I would say. Um, I have so I wrote a book called Rethinking Sex, a Provocation, which came out in 2022. And it was kind of thinking about sexual ethics and relationship norms in the wake of the Me Too moment. I spent a lot of time talking about how consent was not enough of an ethic to make sex, virtuous or moral, but also about the ways that the landscape had shifted due to dating apps and just like due to kind of like the hangover of Me Too. And one of the things that I noticed in talking to a lot of young men, I interviewed young men and young women for the book, was that they seemed really scared. Just like after that moment. And I think in the wake of the sort of very vocal success and platforming of a particular vision of the feminist movement that held that, women were amazing and men were trash. I had guys telling me that they were afraid, like they would never approach a woman in the workplace or ask someone out because they might get in trouble. Like they don't want a sexual harassment claim. That they now understood or thought they understood that talking to a woman unsolicited at a coffee shop or a bar was rude. And so they, like just shouldn't do that. They felt, I think, I don't know that they would have put this word in their mouths, but a little bit sort of neutered by circumstance. And also, I think they were able to allow themselves that, like that sort of sitting back because they had a couple other options on hand. One being just like rampant online pornography, which is definitely easier to reach than repeatedly asking women out and then like taking them on dates and having to be in a relationship to, reach that desired conclusion. And also for some men, at least, dating apps, which you can just sort of like do on your phone. You swipe left, you swipe right. You don't actually have to go through the gauntlet of like approaching someone
Yeah.
and talking to them in person, putting on clothes to impress someone on a date. You can kind of feel like you're doing something, but with much lower effort. Um, so that was one of the things. Then also, I think, um, dating app culture, but also the culture of sort of how we talked about and how we continue to talk about sex at large, to your incel point, kind of made a lot of men think, perhaps more than they did in the past, that everyone was having sex, that everyone should be having sex, that if women were having sex with someone, they might as well be having sex with them. And so if they were not having sex with women, that was like unfair. It was cosmically unfair, it was socially unfair, and women owed it to them, to be in relationships with them, to sleep with them. And I feel like that kind of entitlement is where sort of the broader incel
Yeah.
culture derives from. Like, incels are not just like guys who are lonely. They're guys who are lonely and also mad that the women who should be sleeping with them are not sleeping with them. So that was one thing going on with men. And then also, I guess, another trend that is still happening that we still see is that women are, and I'm actually very happy about this, just becoming more successful, right? They are increasingly succeeding in school and in work. They can provide for themselves. They make their own life choices in certain senses, in many senses. Um, and that, I think, has left a lot of men feeling like, wait, where do I fit in now? Like, I guess women don't want me to be a protector. They don't need me to be a provider. They seem to have like a lot of social life without going on dates with me. So like, what am I? Who am I? What does it mean to be a man, in this moment, or a man that women would want in this moment? What does that look like? And so there's a sort of a lostness there. So I think a lot of that was kind of addressing that, maybe how men might feel about it.
Mhm.
I think for women, there are sort of similar but opposing pressures on the other side. I think that app culture, dating app culture, swipe culture has been, first of all, I'm just an app hater. I think it's actually been terrible for everyone.
Mhm.
But for women, I think it has led many of them to feel a bit disposable. Because again, if you're like swiping on apps, you don't know who anyone is. They don't know you, and so they're under no obligation to act normal,
Right.
frankly. So women can get a lot of solicitation. They can go on dates with people who like treat them badly, or, hook up with them and disappear.
Yeah.
They kind of have no recourse. Lots of women, especially today, say that they feel, some a good amount of fear, when it comes to dating and sort of dating strangers. Um, and then I think there are sort of women who, have been taught this ideal, this like sort of new, modern more that, they should pursue men, that they should like, have their lives in order and be doing the thing, and, be equal partners. But they kind of still want to be pursued, or
Right.
they want relationships, and then the men aren't stepping up, and they still kind of don't feel like they should pursue, so kind of no one is pursuing anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are just like a lot of mixed messages and a real lack of norms, a lack of understanding of what each party is supposed to do.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm a big Friedrich Hayek guy, and one of the things I like about Friedrich Hayek, who's like one of the godfathers of libertarianism, is he was actually a big defender of tradition, norms, customs. Right. He liked common law better than legislation for the reason that like when things come up organically from below society, there's sort of like I always use the analogy. It's like artificial reefs. Like
Hmm.
you put oil rig falls in the bottom of the ocean. Barnacles start attaching to it. Fish start using it as a habitat. Then predators come and hang there. And pretty soon you get a whole ecosystem around it, all based on this one artificial skeleton. And when I'm hearing you talk about it, it's like the network effects of dating from the world I lived in. I am not going to say that I was always great about calling every girl I went on a date with on a timely fashion. Right, some of these problems pre-exist this technology. some of these problems are baked into the crooked timber of humanity. But the thing is like when you used to live in a world where most dates, half of dates, or whatever, I'm sure there's data to back this up, were basically referrals from broader professional or friendship networks. There's a penalty for being too much of a jerk, because you're going to get in trouble with the guy who set you up, or his wife who set you up, or all that kind of stuff. And it reminds me of like, part of the point of marriage is being big parties. Brad Wilcox, our colleague, goes into this at great length, is that everybody's a witness. Everybody there is recognizing as part of the broader community, this contract, this new family, this all that kind of thing. And it's a backstop to help it succeed. One of the problems with like iPhone, with phone and app culture, is that it allows everybody to atomize and not need these broader networks of institutions. And it turns out we need them for all sorts of stuff that we didn't think about. And one of them is like, as an insurance policy to keep men from being just absolute jackasses with the women that they date, right? And also giving women some other external measurement of the quality of these men. Like if a bunch of people say, "Oh, you should really go out with Sam." Yeah, I know he's got that unibrow and he's, he's 6'9" and all that kind of stuff. But he's a really sweet guy and he's really smart. And once you know him, he's really, really funny. And I think you'd really like blah, blah, blah. That kind of external third-party validation, you can't get on an app, right? You just got to take a flyer, and you're going to run into some people who are just really good
at seeming great.
At seeming great rather than being great, right?
Yeah.
And that's very depressing to me.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think this scaffolding and this responsibility is a major thing that's missing from dating culture today. It's that scaffolding and that involvement of other people, and also, frankly, just the embodiment of dating too. Meeting someone in real life and having the opportunity to meet them in real life, to get more information about them than like the 3 lines that you're allowed to see on the app, to have time to get to know someone and judge them based on more than their best, iPhone selfie that they're using as their app profile pic. Because also I think there are a lot of people in this moment who are great. I mean, a lot of people in every moment, let's be honest, who are awesome, are funny, interesting, the sort of person one might like to date, male or female, but who, don't take the best photos for whatever reason. And if dating is mediated by, an app, which basically focuses on sort of appearance and stats, those people kind of never get the chance to shine. They get excluded. There are like a lot of matches that could be made, frankly, in real life, or connections that could be made over time in embodied spaces where people, men and women, get the opportunity to show, their good sides in different ways that just never get to happen because they are filtered out by appearance or height or something else.
There's also, I have a very smart female friend. I just don't know if she wants me to publicly out her about this, but she has a very highly developed theory that a huge part of compatibility and attractiveness is pheromones. And that like some men and some women just present at a certain frequency that the other person is looking for, and there's this instantaneous chemical thing. I think it could be overblown, but I know some people in Silicon Valley. I was talking to them once about this is pre-COVID, and they were really hopeful that like virtual meeting, Zoom stuff would get so good that, it would totally disrupt the travel industry and people wouldn't travel anymore and we would blah, blah, blah. And they were like, the problem is all our neuroscientists tell us that it turns out that in-person communication involves all of these micro neurotic things that don't translate over screens in the same way.
Other signals. Yeah.
And I think there's no truth to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we do have to live in the world.
Yeah. We did evolve to be creatures with other creatures. right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly. I think that's I think that's exactly right. There are a ton of these signals that you can't get through a screen or in a disintermediated way. And then also there's something I think about just dating or thinking about people through the mediation of a screen and through an app in particular, where, you're asked to sort of just like swipe through people ad infinitum. You begin to think that there are so many people,
Yeah.
that there is like a perfect option waiting somewhere, and that you have all of the options in the world for as long as you want, which is not actually true, it turns out. But I think that actually hinders more people in dating than they realize. They become sort of weirdly picky. And also, I guess, weirdly optimistic,
Hmm.
maybe. I mean, optimism is usually a good thing. I would say that optimism is a good thing. But their expectations stop aligning with reality in a sense, and they get sort of trapped in a fantasy of their own making, or of the app's making, I would say.
Yeah. The, I mean, it seems like the through line between this and also like just the plight of 12-year-old girls, which, I saw firsthand, my daughter having an only child in that perfect Jonathan Haidt window of
Oh,
not
yeah.
realizing about the problems with this stuff. Um, FOMO is just one of the biggest problems, right? Men feel like all these other men are having a lot of sex. I was at Fox News during the period where all of the really horrible sexual behavior was going on, and
Hmm.
I'm still kind of pissed no one was telling me about it. But like for the people who worked there, I was just a contributor, so I would go in and out and that kind of stuff. But I was stunned when all these revelations started dropping, and um, uh, it was really interesting. It was finally dawned on me why the zero tolerance for sexual harassment stuff was so necessary. Was
Hmm.
that there was a very small number of young women who just wanted to be famous for being good looking and saw their sexual behavior as transactional.
Hmm.
And there was a much larger group of very attractive young women who did not want that at all. But for the middle-aged dudes who were hearing from colleagues that they could sleep with these younger girls, they had no way of telling
It's
who
all the same.
who was willing, that tiny single digit number that were willing to be transactional like that, and the much larger group of people who may have been flirty or funny or friendly or whatever, but who were not trying to give off that signal. And it created this huge amount of sort of resentment and these midlife crises for these dudes who thought, well, all these other guys are doing this, why can't I do it too? And it destroyed marriages, and it was just really sad in all sorts of ways. And it my favorite quote on this actually comes from Montesquieu, who predates a lot of this app culture by a bit. And
Yeah.
he had this great line. He says, um, about happiness, if one only wished to be happy, this could be easily accomplished. But we wish to be happier than other people. And this is always difficult, for we believe others are happier than they are. And I
Mm.
think that internet culture has created that problem at scale in a way that I don't think anybody could have foreseen when it first came on online.
That's Yeah, that's so true. That's one of my like biggest and hottest takes, uh that I one day I'm going to try and write about this maybe, is that the internet on a whole, and especially the visual internet, um has been bad.
Yeah.
It's just bad for us, frankly. And it should have stayed with DARPA. It should have just stayed with the researchers. I love scientific innovation, that like ideas communication is important, but the average person probably did not need to be connected to this many people
Yeah.
at once. The average person is probably not helped by being able to surveil the lives and doings of others and have their lives surveilled. Like the amount of FOMO that is now possible because you can get on Instagram and, not just like look at your neighbor's lawn and be like, wow, their grass is really green, but look at a billionaire's lawn and be
Yeah.
like, wow, their grass is really green. And it's also their lawn is huge and their life is so much better than mine. Like that is just that level of sort of comparison and connection,
Yeah.
as Mark Zuckerberg would have put it, was actually not good for us,
Yeah.
was not healthy for us. We are not sort of made for that. And it has caused so many sort of manifold crises in the way that we understand ourselves as humans, in the way that we understand and change our interactions with other people. I mean, just like in talking about the younger generation now, in the way that we develop and move through lives, I'm just not sure it was worth it. I don't know.
Yeah. Certainly I'm in internet years, I'm Methuselah, because I had one of the first blogs, and it was before the word blog existed. And then, anyway, we can go into all that some other time. It's not actually particularly interesting. It's just, I've been watching this for a very long time. And the amount of triumphalism and theorizing about how this was going to be great for everybody and foster new senses of community just didn't happen. I mean, it
Yeah.
really, for every positive example that they can turn into an ad for Facebook, there are like 100 negative examples. And I think, this may be a good place to move into politics a little bit. I've often used the example of pedophiles, which I'm very much opposed to.
Whoa. Yeah. Okay.
But
that was a sharp turn.
yeah, well, no, the example is that if you were a pedophile in, say, 1950, pretty hard to find other pedophiles.
Yes.
Pretty hard to start a pedophile club, right? I mean,
Yes.
and they did exist, right? But like, it was hard.
High effort.
Yeah, and you had to start a conversation where there was a very high risk of getting punched in the face, and or arrested, or both. And now with the internet, it's very like, well, just stick with incels. People felt exactly the way you described incels feeling 50, 100 years ago. There was a cultural norm against talking about it, but eventually you'd find one dude who meet another dude who felt the same way, and they'd talk about it, and they'd have a lasting friendship about it, and it'd kind of end there. But with the internet, you can take almost any position and get 500 people, 1,000 people, some number of people way above Dunbar's number of people who say, I'm just like you, and you all of a sudden, because everyone's enumerate in this country, think that you have this huge movement behind you, right?
Yeah.
And that reinforces that creates sort of mini populisms everywhere. And in so much, it seems to me, of our politics these days is, we've been in a populist age since the financial crisis, at least, and social media is designed just to keep that sense going. And everybody feels free to decry populism on the ideological other side, right? So like, all the conservatives, hate Occupy Wall Street and the Bernie Sanders stuff and all that kind of stuff, but they think their populism of, this weird coalition of incels and MAGA bros and all these kinds of things, they're just great.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's fine.
And I'm the reason that this podcast is called The Remnant is because I hate all the populisms. But anyway, it seems to me like, where do you see the gender divide, which in some ways does feel right now more significant than the racial divide? At least it's more interesting to people, it feels like. Maybe because we had such intense conversation, during the George Floyd riot moment, that people are like, let's stop talking about that for a while.
Let's talk about something else. Yeah.
But it does feel like it gets more engagement and conversation, the gender stuff, than the racial stuff these days. And that's not a normative thing. It's just, it feels that way. But do you see any way to get off of this path where the Republican Party basically is the party of masculinity and the Democratic Party is the party of femininity? And since men and women aren't getting along very well these days, that means the parties aren't going to get along very well in all sorts of new ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons why this discussion has just really popped in this moment too is that you saw, if not the traditional Republican Party, Trump and sort of his campaign, his movement, suddenly made a very concerted and visible effort to become sort of masculinity influencers, right? Like, they really went out of their way to go to the MMA tournaments, to be on the Bros podcasts, to, try and describe themselves or portray themselves as like the masculine, the men who are left in the world compared to those weak and feminine and sissy Democrats. And it worked, I think, in part because, as we were talking about earlier, there are a lot of men who feel kind of lost and are looking for a role model. And this was like one of the first to appear. Joe Rogan existed and there was no one else. So, okay, that becomes sort of like our model of masculinity, and whoever side he's on, that's the side for men. And I think the Democrats had a problem in that they didn't really provide an alternative. Like if you're looking for role models, if you're a guy or a woman, but I think this is especially relevant to men, looking for role models, then you'll just go where a role model is found and you will not go where there's no alternative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Democrats are still really struggling to provide an alternative vision of manhood, an alternative vision of masculinity that could stand in contrast to whatever the right is providing and actually be attractive. They tried to do that a little bit with Tim Walz, and it wasn't that successful, in part because I think it felt
Forced,
kind of astroturfed,
yeah,
in hindsight. But until the left can provide a clear and compelling sort of vision of masculinity and model of masculinity that can compete with Trump's like very clear, very legible, I'm not going to say it's a good model, but like very obvious vision of masculinity, then there's why would a man like sort of turn there? Why would they switch sides? So yeah, I think that's what we're going to be waiting for a while, unless the Democrats can provide something compelling for men, then men will continue to go to the right. And then I think also when you think about women, the model of masculinity, the model of manhood, the model of sort of gender relations, more generally, that the right seems to be really interested in promoting, is in many ways a kind of retrograde one. And I think one that actually a lot of women, especially young women, find insulting. The insistence that maybe women should stop working. Maybe they should just stay in the home. Maybe the only right way for a woman to be is a super feminine trad wife. Even the pro-natalist movement in some of the ways that the right talks about natalism, being like, well, women are falling down on the job and they should have more children. They should just do it. We're not going to provide child care or any real benefits, but women should just like want to do this. That is not attractive to a lot of women. And so they will be alienated from that vision of gender that the Republican Party is providing. And their alternative is very clear. The Democratic Party has fielded female leaders, has been very vocal about wanting to support women in various ways, and sort of focus on women's rights in various ways. Although how they define women's rights can be, debated in some circles. And so there's just like there's like an attraction for men on the right, and then like a repellent for women too. So it's not just one thing.
Yeah, so I'm very torn about all of this because there's a lot in there, right? So on the one hand, I sit back and I think for a second when you start saying how the Democrats need to provide, and I think you're descriptively correct. So this is not a criticism really, but when I hear you saying the Democrats need to provide a positive vision of an attractive vision of masculinity to attract men, it makes me want to cut myself. I mean, it's just like and I think again, I think you're right, but it's the dumbest freaking thing that parties should be competing over basically the pheromones they secrete, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like this, and this is one of the things why I'm a conservative, right? I think societies get themselves into trouble in all sorts of ways when positive cultural norms take on a partisan valence. So I would rather live in a society where there was just simply no competition between the parties about what constituted the ideal of masculine behavior, which I would say needs to be informed by concepts of gentlemanliness, to want of a better word, right? And I'm one of those people who thought Bill Clinton, what Bill Clinton did with Monica Lewinsky was terrible, and that his sexual history was a real black mark on him. And I think Donald Trump's sexual history is a real black mark on him. I have a real problem with conservatives who think Clinton's behavior is outrageous, but Donald Trump's proves he's an alpha male.
Right. He's our guy, so it's fine when he does
and
it.
I can't reconcile those things, right? So, and it seems to me a part of the problem is for years I wanted my wife to write. My wife is a political writer, ghostwriter, and has written a lot about Title IX and all sorts of things like that. I wanted her to write a book. So there's a famous guy, Albert J. Nock. He's the guy who gave the title "The Remnant" for this. I got it largely from him. He wrote a famous book in the 40s called "Our Enemy, the State," and it's a very libertarian book, right? I wanted her to write a book called "My Husband, the State," and which was, I don't know if you remember The Life of Julia. Right. But so my crowd back then, when I was in good standing on the right, we had a lot of fun with The Life of Julia, which was basically just this political weird cartoon, which talked about how Julia, this fictional single woman, from basically cradle to grave, all of the great benchmarks in her life were provided to or enabled by the government. There's no husband, there are no parents in The Life of Julia. It's like each panel begins under President Obama, Julia goes to college. Under President Obama.
Who produced it?
I don't know.
Where did it come from?
It was so glorious that it's like the Pajama Boy ad. Some things you just don't want to question because they're too much fun to make fun of. And there was always, going back to Chris Matthews in the 1990s, he had this whole thesis about the Republicans were the daddy party and the Democrats were the mommy party, and the Democrats were nurturing and protective and all of these things, and the Republicans were the guys who go around the house making sure all the doors are locked and turn off the lights. And those are the two images that they projected. And I get that as a cultural kind of thing. It seems to me, though, that the problem is that when it comes to women, you can actually come up with a slate of very real public policies that are designed to, whether it's the cartoonish Life of Julia thing or just, figuring out how you manage this distinction between having kids and having work, right? And all that. I don't know what masculine policies would be, right? Yeah. So they have to be culture war. They has to be culture war BS, because it's, other than figuring out sort of inefficient jobs programs for people with stronger backs, I just don't know what the male helping men legislation public policy program would necessarily be. And so,
do you think it's tariffs and bringing manufacturing back to American shore?
I think the rhetoric for that is yes, but the reality of that is no.
Is no. Yeah.
I mean, because like the last thing that the women who do want to get married want are the kind of men who are not qualified to do anything other than turn tiny screws or sew sneakers for $4.50 an hour.
The apple factory.
Yeah. So
on short apple factory.
So it helps me realize that a lot of like the Trumpian stuff, the culture war stuff, has to be culture war, because there isn't a policy program that you can give to men that men are going to say, oh yeah, that's the policy, that's the program I want. But then I have some sympathy for the There's a rich tradition of argument that says that part of the problem with the way modern feminism works is that it's taking the male standard and making it the universal standard. And so this idea that somehow, Patrick Deneen plays with this a little bit, and I have my problems with Patrick Deneen, but he's like, all we mean by feminism is meaning that women can be cogs of industrial capitalism too. I don't really agree with that, but there's a point in there, right? In that this idea that working 80 hours a week, which is the male standard, that's what women should want too. And I'm not sure that's right.
And I mean, actually, this is a point that I've made in my book and that I've written about not infrequently. Like, there's sort of the idea of the girl boss, right? Which is kind of falling out of favor right now, but was sort of the overarching ideal for quite a while, was just that it was a boss, like a male boss, who happened to be a girl.
Yeah.
There was no difference. You were still working 80 hours a week and like being mean to your subordinates, not having an outside life, but you got to do it while being a girl. And that actually was not a good ideal for anyone, not even for men, but just like enabling women to do it too didn't make women's lives any better. It just made them more like the worst kind of male. And I think that's really true, actually, to tag back to the first part of our conversation in the dating world. And I feel like that is one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of discontent among young women, especially. You know, there's a certain um, feminist. Well, so I would also say that it's not true feminism, actually. I think this is a feminism that's been co opted by a kind of like dark capitalism and sort of like a liberal, a faux liberal ideal, actually. Because the original feminists cared a lot about the idea of care, um, about not necessarily sameness, but like shared affection and love between the sexes. Um, but yeah, when it comes to the sexual realm, there is this idea that the popular understanding of sexual empowerment is that women should just go out and have sex like men do.
Right.
Like instead of, you know, wanting affection, they should also hop from bed to bed and be really happy about it. And then actually a lot of women look at that or they even try that and they're like, wait, I don't like this.
Yeah.
Actually, this is not providing me with the being like a man is not making me as happy as men seem to be doing
Right.
the same thing. What is wrong with me? And then the structures that, you know, sort of spring up or the norms that spring up around this understanding end up disfavoring women too. Like, you know, an expectation that, hey, you're a strong feminist woman. You too can sleep with a guy on the first date
Yeah.
and you'll feel fine about it. Like, turns out not to be true. That's not actually the sort of equality that really helped them.
Yeah.
That was a quality that made them more like kind of the worst sort of man on the dating scene. And in fact, also empowered that guy because then he got to sleep with like way more women. But it
Yeah. I mean, the dudes
didn't
love
actually
it.
make the women feel
I
better.
mean, the dudes are psyched if women want to have this attitude that, you
Yeah.
know, one night stands are great. You know, like you're not delivering. Like even the incels will be loving that news. But like, I mean, one can obviously take the stuff too far. But it just, you know, I remember when I first read Robert Wright's book, The Moral Animal. It was one of the first places I got into some of this data. It's like, and now it's just sort of obvious. You know, the 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 gender divide on people who consume porn. You know, it's I don't know what the latest number is, 95-5 male to female, right? It's like what counts as enjoyable porn for women is just a different thing
Altogether.
altogether, right? I mean, it's let's call it erotica instead of, right? You know, the kind of thing. It's about stories and whatever. And that should just tell you something. It doesn't mean, I mean, I personally I think women have a morally better understanding even in that realm, right? Whatever you think of that realm, than the male version of it. But you can take morality out of it and just say it has to do with just different psychological wiring for all sorts of obvious reasons. And you're kind of not allowed to just sort of talk about it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's and I can kind of understand I understand the justification for why that is. But I think we also need to get to a point where we can say, okay, we understand the justification, but maybe this is not helpful. So to backtrack, what is the justification for not talking about this? I think, you know, we all sort of know at this point that um, men have had privileged status in society, that the male ideal is seen as, you know, the ideal often, and anything that's seen as like feminized or female is sometimes seen as less than.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think people who care about, you know, female empowerment, um, equality in some sense, really worry that by getting specific about gender differences, saying men are like this and women are like this, they're going to like automatically code whatever is female as worse,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that it has been historically. And so they would rather just be like, no, 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 everyone's the same. Everyone is the same, and that means all of these traits are worth the same thing. One is not better than the other. One is not different than the other, because allowing difference means that some difference might be classified as less than, and that's what they're trying to avoid. So I understand that impulse, but then it just sort of elides important differences and doesn't leave space to recognize how to best, help different people. Like the way to make a woman's life better, because a woman's life is a specific thing, is not going to be the same way that you make a man's life better. I mean, in some senses it might be, like higher pay generally, like a stronger social safety net, etc., helps everybody. But okay, women go through childbirth, have periods where, child rearing might be a bigger part of their lives, and men just don't,
Mhm.
for instance. And to actually address that difference, you have to speak specifically about like the female life cycle or a woman's life cycle, which is maybe different than a man's life cycle.
Yeah, and also, I mean, like I give this advice to. It's less advice than an observation, but with men, and there's a lot of social science data to back this up. But in my experience, both literally my experience, but also my experience with my friends and stuff, the most productive work time for men is after they have kids, particularly after they have their first kid. And there are some just so evolutionary biology reasons for it. I must provide for, my offspring. Let's say there's some truth to that. I don't know, I don't know if it's 1% or 10% or 100%, but not 100%. But there's a sociological or psychological reason for it as well, which is that when you have a new baby, it's so hard on the mom, and there are so many demands on time that literally the only thing you get a free pass to do is work.
His work.
Right. And so if you want to get away from changing diapers and screaming and bottle feeding and all of that kind of stuff, and you say to your wife, I'm going to go play golf, your wife is like, are you freaking kidding me?
You
No,
need to
you're
be doing
not.
something useful at the very least.
Go write your book. Go write your column. You can do those things, but you don't get. I don't have free time. You don't get free time, right? And I think that that's just a fact of life kind of thing. And I think, and that's probably one of the things that exacerbates the divergence in earnings is that right when women withdraw from the workplace for a little while, men
are ramping up,
are turbocharging because they feel like now they literally are the sole breadwinner, right? And so they want to be, as productive as possible, and also it's the only excuse they have to not be stay-at-home dads. And I think there's room somewhere to acknowledge some of that kind of stuff in policy too, right? I mean, like like male psychology has its benefits here or there as well, but I'm kind of curious, just not to change gears too suddenly, but when you were talking about the sex differences stuff, the debate over trans stuff issues, which is diverse and complicated. I'm less interested. I don't know if you're a TERF or whatever, and it doesn't really matter. But like, you can answer any of those kind of related questions that you want. But it seems to me that that came at a particularly bad moment for Democrats on this, even as they were talking, as you were saying, needing to model a better version of masculinity and failing. They were making this case that, at least as filtered out through popular media, that males should be able to compete against females after a 20-year campaign to convince. My wife recently wrote about the revenge of the Title IX dads, right? Where we watched for 20 years this concerted and very successful cultural movement led basically by feminists to say, you need to honor women's participation in sports as much as you honor you have to honor your daughter's participation as much as you honor your sons. And that largely succeeded. And like dads are all into their daughter's sports, and then all of a sudden you change the policy where you say, okay, biological males now can compete against your daughters. And that freaked out just a ton of dads. And you can say wrongly or whatever, but just
Whiplash, yeah.
as a cultural signal, it was just really ill time for a Democratic Party that was seemingly going in that direction. And I'm just kind of curious, like, how to put this in a concrete way. What did you think of the ad that the Trump campaign ran against Kamala Harris about the gender reassignment surgeries for illegal immigrants, right? I mean, there are lots of people, I go on CNN all the time, and they insist that Trump won because he was anti-trans. And my response is, he had the anti-trans vote locked down. This ad was effective because it sent this signal that the Democratic Party cared about these weird boutique issues rather than bread and butter issues. And that she's for they, them, he's for you was less about the actual substance of the pronoun stuff and the transgender stuff, but it was more about the cultural signaling about how the Republican Party is more normal and attentive to your problems. But I'm kind of curious, how do you process the trans debate in the midst of all of these other cross-cutting things?
Yeah, that point about Title IX dads and the whiplash they probably felt with this is really interesting. And I haven't thought about that particular angle hadn't occurred to me, but it makes total sense. Um, I think that we had kind of already entered a moment of gender norm confusion, where sort of the past understandings of gender and sex were kind of melting down a little bit, and people were sort of feeling at a loss for structure, talking about how men were like trying to figure out what it means, are trying to figure out what it means to be a man. Um, and people are feeling that really personally right now, I think, and like really seeking clarity, or at least seeking some perhaps reassurance that like that's a real question that they're asking, and like people are their political figures or their leadership or something are taking that concern seriously. And I think by elevating the trans issue so much, the Democratic Party, in a sense, was saying that like those concerns were fake or didn't matter. Like actually gender isn't real anyway. So whatever you're complaining about like is not a real thing to be worried about. It kind of feels like a dismissal of the deep worries that I think a lot of people had as it comes, you know, as it refers to gender and roles and sort of how to be in the world. I think a lot of, I don't know that, and I'm articulating this aloud here in sort of a halting way because I too am trying to think about how to articulate it.
It's a tough thing to figure out how to talk about with compassion and with decency, but also believing in norms, you know?
Yeah, well, and I think that maybe people um wouldn't have necessarily like articulated this to themselves, but I think for a lot of people it kind of felt like the Democratic Party was, by focusing on the trans issue and saying like, no, you have to, this is real, like you have to think about it in this way, was denying reality in some sense, denying the felt understandings of sex and gender, and the way that men and women exist in the world and relate to each other, that people felt clearly on the ground and were in fact grappling with themselves. It kind of felt like, I think Democratic leadership was just pretending that all that didn't exist or didn't matter, and denying reality is very insulting, actually, to people, and really alienating. And so I don't think that the Democratic Party was like doing that on purpose, and I don't know that voters might have articulated it in exactly that way, but I think there was some of that disconnect going on. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I think part of the explanation also is, for honorable and decent reasons, Democrats want to take the side of persecuted minorities, right? And that's just sort of a cultural norm that just kicks in. I think it's a very American norm in a lot of ways, but it's particularly acute for for Democrats. And the problem is, and longtime listeners of this podcast know I can rant about this quite a bit, but like I think that the Democrats got themselves into a problem where they were in a bubble where their best and brightest people from Harvard and Princeton and Yale and the people from the consulting firms and the green rooms at MSNBC and that kind of thing said, this is just like any other civil rights issue, and you're on the right side of it, and you're the one who's being inclusive. And inclusive is a strange word in politics because you're inclusive towards some people, but you can actually turn off more people with your inclusivity. And so the example I'll often use is like Latinx. Like progressive polling firms over and over and over again kept telling Democrats, stop using this term. Most Latinos or most Hispanics in this country don't know it. The ones who hear it by like 5 to 1 don't like it.
Don't enjoy it.
They think it's like some smug white Prius driving liberal telling us how to use our language and telling us how to do our culture. But if you come from that rarefied world of academia where it's a way to make a point in a seminar, and the people who make a living as sort of translators of that language tell you this is the way to be inclusive, this is the way to signal that you're welcoming everybody in, Democrats used it without realizing they were turning off more people than they were attracting, particularly the people they were trying to be inclusive to.
Yeah.
And I think like the transgender thing plays that way insofar as, yes, it's inclusive and the desire to be compassionate and accommodating to these people is a good and noble one in many respects. And certainly comes from, I think, from a good place in a lot of people. I think some people just like being transgressive, and I'm less into that. But the way it signifies outside of your bubble is very, very different. And I think so it's sort of like, it's another example of these politics, sort of like Trump's tweeting like an escaped monkey from a cocaine study, right? It's like they say, well, he has to reward his base, or the left people say, it's being inclusive. And I'm like, it's like the salesman who says, sure, we're losing money on every sale, but we'll make up for it in volume, right? And like they forget that politics is supposed to be about addition. And I can have sympathy for transgender people, but like if the Democratic Party sticks to the way they were talking about this issue 4 years ago, they're going to turn off more voters than they attract, and not just white toxic male types, but like African American men, Hispanic men. Just a lot of Americans don't like that stuff, particularly when it comes to like the sports stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I guess politics, we know this, right? Like politics is kind of an art of compromise, of like being able to speak to a coalition of, or create a coalition of many groups at once, and like balance different sets of interests and desires. And if you're just if you're sort of privileging or focusing on one group to the extent that you're turning off all the other groups, and you're not doing politics very well.
Yeah. I mean, I also think you just get into trouble when you start talking about, and this is one of the reasons I don't like identity politics too much, is that when you start talking about categories, abstract categories of people rather than like specific communities, you give people permission who disagree with you to also think about people as abstract categories, right? And
which rarely ends well.
Which does, it can be a race to the bottom, right? And I just think the vibe shift has left the left with in dire search of a new vocabulary, and the stuff about finding a positive role for men, portrayal of men, which again I find just so weird. Is part of that, right? It's like, I thought it was fascinating when Tim Walz said at Harvard, my job was to code speak to white men who watch football and fix their cars.
Yeah, to code switch.
Yeah, and like, it was so perfect, because really what the Democratic Party needed was dudes who watch football, needed a dude who watches football and fixes his cars to talk to people who use phrases like code switch to stop doing that, right? I mean, they got the translator was going the wrong direction. But anyway, it's a very weird moment.
Yeah, it is. It is indeed a strange moment. I mean, to go back to the sort of earlier point that I was making about the internet being bad, frankly, I sense, Jonah, and tell me if this is wrong, but that you really wish that politics was, in some sense, offline, um, or that, politicians had to spend sort of less time focusing on these culture war issues and like these like weird hobbyist groups and just on the actual policies and the laws.
For the most part, I think that's fair. I mean, I'm with Yuval on this. I think transparency is generally bad. And like, and
The internet's all about transparency, about sharing everything.
Yeah, and that's it, right? I mean, like I mean, transparency of what's in a law is vitally important, right? Transparency of the results of what the policies are important, but I think we need less visibility into the interior functioning of government and to the interior functioning of our lives. Enough, you know, Instagramming your personal life and making everything sort of main character syndrome stuff. And, my friend Megan McArdle talks about how the internet has made American politics like we all live in a really small town where everybody's all up in our business. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so, I want normie bourgeois government where most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about politics.
Right. Like, I don't want to have to follow my congressman on Instagram and like see their workout photos. I just like want them to go to Congress and like do their job, and I don't have to think about it.
Yeah. Cut the deficit and get back to me later. And then you can tell me about your quinoa salad or whatever. All right, Christine Emba, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll be back.